Welcome to the St. John's East debate on the environment. Okay, do I have sound? Is that better? That any better? Good. Welcome to the St. John's East debate on the environment. We'll start the event with a land acknowledgement. We respectfully acknowledge the territory in which we gather as the ancestral homelands of the Beothuk, and the island of Newfoundland as the ancestral homelands of the Mi'kmaq and Beothuk. We would also like to recognize the Inuit of Nunatsiavut and Nunatukavut and the Innu of Nitassinan and their ancestors as the original people of Labrador. We strive for respectful relationships with all the peoples of this province as we search for collective healing and true reconciliation and honor this beautiful land together. As part of our commitment to addressing the current climate emergency, we need to support Indigenous self-government and respect for this land. A land acknowledgement is one tiny piece of this work. The 100 Debates on the Environment event is organized nationally by GreenPAC, a nonpartisan, nonprofit organization working to elect and support environmental leaders of all major parties running for office, and it's supported locally by the Social Justice Cooperative of Newfoundland and Labrador, by Too Big to Ignore, Fishing for Success, and by several other partners at Memorial University, including the Department of Political Science, the Department of Sociology, the Department of Philosophy, and the Nexus Center of Humanities and Social Sciences Research. Many thanks to all of these sponsors, to our moderator tonight, Christine O'Neill Yates, to the candidates who have agreed to participate, to our volunteers, and to all of you for taking time out of your busy lives to participate in this event. Before I turn the podium over to Christine, I just want to explain that 8 of the questions that are going to be asked to the candidates tonight are pre-programmed. But we will be accepting 2 questions from the audience. If you have a question you would like to submit for consideration, you have 2 options to do that. One is if you're in the room and you don't have access to email, you can put up your hand and someone will bring you a clipboard with some paper and a pen. You can write it down and it will be collected from you. If you have a cell phone or you're watching from online, you have the option of sending an email. And the email address to which you should direct your question is 100debatesyyt, that's all one word, @gmail.com. So that's 100debatesyyt@gmail.com. Chris?
Thank you, Barb. Thank you so much. And I'm pleased to be here tonight, and thank you to you for taking time out of your schedule to come out and to have a discussion as we consider who we vote for in this upcoming election. I'll give you a little explanation of how this will work very briefly. As Barb mentioned, there are 10 questions tonight. Each candidate will have an opportunity to answer a question that I will pose. The order in which they answer has been selected randomly. Then in reverse order to the answers, each candidate will have the opportunity to comment on one other candidate's answer. It may be a statement, a question, or both. Their opponent will then be given the opportunity to respond, and the speaking times are weighted in favor of local questions because we do have some questions of national significance as well. I will be, candidates, strictly enforcing the time limit. The time limit for the first question will be 2.5 minutes. I'll introduce the candidates and then we'll get to the first question and the order. This evening we have the pleasure of being joined by Nick Whalen, the Liberal candidate in St. John's East, David Peters, the Green candidate, and Jack Harris is here as your candidate for the New Democratic Party. And I'd like to thank them and welcome them here this evening. I'll ask the first question. Greenhouse gas emissions and climate change around the world. We are seeing inspiring examples of leadership to reduce greenhouse gas pollution and accelerate the shift to a more green economy. At the same time, we're seeing a ramp up of the effects of climate change. We see extreme weather events across the country, including wildfires, flooding, and droughts, and these are causing anxiety and worry given their enormous financial and environmental impact. Per person, Canadians produce the most greenhouse gas pollution of all G20 industrialized nations, including the US, nearly 3 times the G20 average and 8 tons per person. My first question is tonight, our first speaker will be Jack Harris, and the question to you is, what will you do as an MP to ensure Canada does its share to ensure we have a safe climate? And what are the key elements of an action plan that you will advocate for to ensure Canada meets its international obligations to reduce greenhouse gas pollution? Mr. Harris, you have 2 minutes and 30 seconds starting now.
Thank you. Thank you, Chris, and thank you to everybody for coming here tonight and to the organizers for making this opportunity available for us to talk about this important issue. Of course, climate change is of enormous concern to Canadians. We are facing more and more climate-related disasters like fires and floods, and our Arctic is heating up 3 times as fast as the planet. It may seem daunting, but we absolutely can meet our targets to keep people safe and make sure that no part of the country gets left behind. We will set tough, science-based targets in line with keeping warming to 1.5 degrees. This means cutting our emissions significantly more than the Liberals have committed to. And we'll keep ourselves accountable with regular audits from an independent watchdog. We will be setting up a climate accountability office to keep track of that. We will first of all meet our G20 commitment to end subsidies to fossil fuels. And our plan will create 3,000 good jobs all over Canada within our first mandate and rebuild local economies while lowering our emissions by investing in green infrastructure projects, energy, and technology. We have about 7 pages of our 109-page platform devoted to specific actions that we would undertake to achieve these targets and to get ourselves to a carbon-free economy. I'm not going to repeat them all here tonight. They're available online. But I do want to end some of them. I do want to talk about some of them. We want to end the big breaks to polluters on the carbon price that the Liberals brought in. We want to save families over $1,000 every year with energy efficiency retrofits, with a goal of all housing stock being retrofitted by 2050. We will work to have electrified transit across the country by 2030 and launch a Canada Climate Bank to make big, meaningful investments in innovative and clean energy projects that we need. We'll also make sure that Indigenous people are always full and equal partners in our efforts to confront climate crisis by implementing the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People and giving Indigenous leadership a seat at the table to help direct the efforts to fight climate change.
That was great. Your time's up and you had 2 seconds to spare. Thank you, Jack Harris. Our next speaker will be David Peters.
Thank you, Chris. I'm hearing that the most important issue for the citizens of St. John's East is that we need to do everything humanly possible to stabilize the climate and the life-sustaining capability of the planet. Given that we are currently on the road to climate disaster, and given that successive Liberal and Conservative majority governments have frittered away 3 decades in power where relatively minor legislative and regulatory changes would have made Canada a responsible environmental citizen nation, we absolutely need to create a path dependency for a 60+% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions by 2030 and net zero emissions by 2050. This is not a nice to do. The science is clear. This is a must do. This means we need to do many things. Number one, We need to establish an all-party war cabinet, firmly establishing climate change as a nonpartisan public policy issue. 2, we need to establish a national east-west energy grid with zero-emission sources of power by 2030. 3, we need to cancel the Trans Mountain pipeline expansion and all federal subsidies to the petroleum industry, which would free tens of billions of dollars of federal money over the next parliamentary mandate. 4, we must stop issuing new petroleum exploration and production licenses nationwide. 5, we must sunset tar sands mining by 2030 to 2050 and transition the workforce there through training to renewable energy and building insulation retrofits, creating 4 million jobs. 6th, we need to research and implement geothermal power generation at mothballed tar sands mines. 7, cancel importation of foreign oil, refine Newfoundland offshore oil in Canada for use in Canada as we sunset the industry. 8, prohibit the sale of new vehicles with internal combustion engines by 2030. And 9, invest big in high-speed rail and heavy travel corridors to offer great incentive for travelers on short-haul flights to travel by rail. If we do these things, we have a fighting chance, and then maybe we baby boomers can look young people in the eye again. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Peters. And now we will hear from the Liberal candidate, Nick Whalen.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Dr. Neese, for introducing us, and thank you, Chris, for moderating tonight. And thank you all for coming. I know how busy it can be. I'm missing my own son's 11th birthday tonight, so I know that family things can intervene. And of course, missing from the stage here tonight is Jody Wall, the CPC candidate, who I understand has family issues of his own to deal with. But I'm so glad that you're here and that climate is important to you, and it's as important to you as it is to me. We have an important choice to make as citizens on who we're going to vote for on October 21st or before. And it's important because after the election, one person is going to be asked whether or not they'll form the government. It could be Andrew Scheer, who promises to eliminate our price on pollution, or it could be Justin Trudeau, who plans to move forward with a realistic plan to see us achieve net zero by 2050, and I'm glad the Green Party supports that proposal. You know, there's a lot of rhetoric and anxiety that goes around this topic, but I'm an analytic person, I'm an engineer, a former lawyer, and that's how I approach problems. I'm not going to be led by fear. I'm just going to approach the problem analytically and try to solve it in a common sense way with solutions that work. And I can look my children in the eye, David. I'm proud of what we've accomplished over the last 4 years. It was our government that, as a first order of business, sent Minister McKenna, a good friend of mine, to Paris to negotiate the Paris Climate Agreement and make sure that that agreement included a 1.5 degrees Celsius target instead of a 2 degrees Celsius target. We fought long and hard over the past 4 years to implement a price on pollution. That is not easy to do because a lot of people like to call it a carbon tax, but we've realized that that's a difficult thing to sell, so we call it a price on pollution. But it's important because it's the thousands of decisions that consumers make every week and families make throughout this country every year that determine how much carbon dioxide we generate as a nation. And it's a price on pollution that works in Europe and British Columbia and California and Quebec to lower emissions. So we need one in Canada, and now we have one, and it survived court challenges. But we have so much more to do, more than the 1,200 public transit projects we've initiated across the country, more than the 50 other projects. We're going to help 1.5 million Canadians renovate their homes. We're going to achieve net zero by 2050, and I look forward to providing more details as we answer questions together tonight. Thank you.
And thank you to all three of you for being so diligent and staying within the 2.5 minutes. I appreciate that. So right now, in reverse order of the candidates, in the order you just heard them in, each will have the opportunity to comment on one other candidate's answer. This may be a statement, a question, or both, and you will have 1 minute to do so. And we begin with Nick Whalen.
Thank you very much, Chris. And David, since I took best notes on your comments earlier, I just want to talk a little bit about some of the things that you'd raised. Certainly, I agree that climate change is a very important existential issue. It's why I attended the climate rally this past week. It was great to see you there. I'm glad that the Green Party accepts the Liberal plan to achieve net zero by 2050 as the goal that we should be working towards. On subsidies, you raised the issue that we still have subsidies. Well, we are in the process of phasing out 8 out of 9 of those subsidies, and we're working towards it. It's not something that happens overnight. For example, one of the subsidies is to help Indigenous communities use diesel in the north. We have to transition those communities off diesel, but that's one of the 9 that we need to fix in a way that makes sense and that doesn't cause more harm than good. I'm glad that your party is so focused on everything we're trying to do, because as we work together as a country, as we pull together in the same direction, we'll achieve these goals. So keep doing what you're doing.
Okay, the candidate, Mr. Peters will have 30 seconds for rebuttal.
That's really good to hear, and we want to promote the idea of doing politics differently in the Green Party of Canada. This is why we advocate for an all-party cabinet after October 21st. It's akin to all the metaphors we talked about, the Manhattan Project or Green New Deal or whatever metaphor you want to say. It's hopeful, I guess, in some respects, although
Your time is up, sir. You have now 1 minute, however, to make a comment on another candidate's opening remarks.
Thank you, Chris. So in 1992, a lot of you in the audience are old enough to remember, excuse me, the Kyoto Protocol and the Kyoto Accord. And the Liberal Party of Canada spent 10 years in power doing nothing. After signing the Kyoto Protocol, Canada's greenhouse gas emissions were 600 megatons CO2 equivalent in 1992. They're now over 700 million megaton equivalent. And they're up in 2018 over 2017. We're not making progress here. I feel like Canada feels like Lucy and Charlie Brown holding the football. The Liberal Party is asking us to trust them again for the 3rd time or 4th time, and they don't do anything. So I don't know if we believe you, frankly.
You have 30 seconds.
Thank you, David.
Rebuttal, Mr. Whalen.
I was in university studying engineering in 1992, and I can neither apologize for nor explain what people would have done back then in 1993 and following. But what I will say is for the past 4 years, we have worked so hard to develop a realistic plan that's costed, that works, and that will achieve the goals that we set forth. Estimates say that we've already done enough to achieve 79% of our goal, and with the new initiatives that we've announced in this platform, we will achieve our goal of meeting our Paris commitments and net zero by 2050.
Thank you, Mr. Whalen. Now we move to Mr. Harris, who will have 1 minute to either make a statement or a question about another candidate's answer.
Thank you very much, Chris. I have a problem with the position taken by the Liberal Party that they have done in the last 4 years what needs to be done. I mean, we have Mr. Trudeau claiming that they're on track, for example, to meet the 2030 climate target. Well, that's been refuted by a CBC analysis. In fact, their own internal organization, the Environment and Climate Change Canada, which regularly publishes updates, said that they have not, they would get to 63% of the way to their 2030 target based on programs that are in place, even ones that haven't been put in place but are announced. That's not performance. And not only that, this has been described as being misleading. They had the methane plan to eliminate methane and had climate targets for that in 2017, which they postponed for 3 years.
Thank you, Mr. Harris. Your time is up.
Megatons of greenhouse
Mr. Whalen,
gases
you
to our
have.
climate.
I'll ask you to hold your applause to the end of the questions to give the candidates the optimal amount of time. You have 30 seconds, Mr. Whalen.
Thank you very much. I think what everyone is saying up here on the stage is that the Liberal Party has a plan. I mean, we're sort of talking about whether or not it's achieving 79% or 63%, whether or not we're counting our public transit investments or not, whether or not we're including innovation or not. Well, I will say is back in the 1800s, people used whale oil. Whales were going extinct, but then a new product came along, and then whales weren't going extinct because of that reason anymore, because people were using petroleum. As we innovate, as people have choices, our price will work better.
And thank you to all of the candidates. That's the conclusion to question 1. Yes. Yes, and I have been informed I should ask you to, when you begin your rebuttal, to name the candidate. It was kind of obvious, but just state it up front, the candidate that you're rebutting. We'll get to question 2, and this is on the oil and gas sector. In the past year, 3 spills have let 264,000 liters of oil into our oceans. CEO Scott Tessier of the CNLOPB, our offshore regulator, has deemed 2018 a disappointment. In addition to spill impacts, the seismic blasts used in offshore oil exploration have raised environmental concerns about their effects on fish and plankton. I'd like to ask each candidate, what will you do to ensure that ongoing production in existing oil fields is pursued in a safe and environmentally responsible manner? And just as importantly, how will you approach potential new exploration and development proposals, given concerns over the sustainability of further fossil fuel extraction in our carbon-constrained world? And our first person to respond to this question will be Liberal candidate Nick Whalen.
Thank you very much for this question. As anyone who may have heard the Premier or Seamus O'Regan speak about this topic knows, I've worked extremely hard on behalf of our industry and also on behalf of environmental groups to make sure we get this right. Under Bill C-69, which is transformative legislation for our country, people may have heard that we are doing things a little bit differently. One of the things we're doing, and it's not meant to cause anyone any anxiety, either who are for or against oil and gas development, is we're making sure that Indigenous people are involved in the process and properly funded from the get-go so that their concerns are addressed. We've worked hard to make sure that the office that was in Halifax that would assess our regional environmental assessment would be moved to St. John's. That regional environmental assessment is ongoing. We have some experience with this because we shepherded through 3 environmental assessments with these I guess what I would say a template for these new rules. BP in the Gulf, ExxonMobil, and Equinor right now on our shores. And it's important. This is important work that needs to be done, but it needs to be done the right way. And you'll see, if you look at those environmental assessments, that the conditions that are placed on the operators are very stringent. They're evidence-based, they're scientific, and they make sure that we protect our environment, and they're dictated to the environment where the operators are going to be. For the regional environmental assessment that's happening now, there's a panel in place, 4 Newfoundlanders, 1 non-Newfoundlander with the necessary expertise who are going to help determine what conditions need to be put in place for drilling on the northeast slope. This is incredibly important, and it helps us achieve our goal of fast but robust review processes for exploratory drilling, because $4.6 billion has been committed to explore our offshore resources. And we want to make sure that money is spent wisely and that the environmental restraints are in place. And I trust the work of that expert panel that they're doing, and that come April, there'll be a new regime in place where the money is spent, but it's spent better than it has been in the past. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Whalen. And this question, by the way, candidates have 2 minutes. And we next go to the NDP candidate, Jack Harris. Your 2 minutes start now.
Thank you, Chris. The oil from our offshore fields in Newfoundland and Labrador will be part of our energy mix for some time. And in order to be satisfied with the regime, we need to make sure that we're leaders both in safety and environmental protection. I don't think that we have confidence in the situation that we have right now. From the get-go in the offshore of Newfoundland oil development, there has not been independent environmental observers even allowed on the platforms or have access to the environment. That's a serious problem. We need a regulator that's able to assert itself independently in environment and safety, which is why we are extremely desirous of having a separate offshore board that deals with both environment and safety. We've seen some of the problems with self-reporting in the oil spill situation where we don't get the full story right away. It's very difficult to find out exactly what's going on, and that causes a lack of confidence that we're really being well served by our oil and gas regulator. We would want to ensure that that separated out from the mandate that the CNLOPB has for the development itself is that separate oversight of both the environment and safety, and we need to ensure that we have in place a world-class oil spill response to ensure that if anything does happen, and we've seen it happen recently, even though someone suggests, oh, well, this is a new field, it's a new development. Oil has been being produced out of Hibernia, for example, for over 20 years. We shouldn't be having the kind of difficulties that we've been having, and if proper regulation were in place, I don't think we would have the kind of spills that we've had recently.
Thank you, Mr. Harris. Your 2 minutes start now, Mr. Peters.
Thank you, Chris. The task we have at hand is a big one, right? We're talking about the preservation of a robust natural world and saving human civilization. It's pretty big, right? No small task, no small risk involved. Exploration and issuance of new exploration and extraction licenses in the Newfoundland and Labrador offshore is incompatible with this solemn obligation. Our experience with deepwater oil production has to end in our lifetimes. It's fact. It's essential to remember that the ocean environment in which our petroleum extraction occurs is dynamic and at times very volatile. At least one of the spills we've seen recently was in the aftermath of a violent storm. Spill cleanups, challenged at the best of times out there, are all the more challenged by storm events that we know are made more extreme in our time of climate emergency. It's also not just the risks to marine environment to and from our offshore facilities. The tankers that go to and from Come By Chance, the second largest emitter in the province, have the small but catastrophic risk to marine and seabird environments. It haunts me to this day that there could be a spill that reaches Cape St. Mary's Bird Sanctuary. Of course, there is also the CNLOPB. Much has been said in other fora about whether this regulatory body is captured by the interests of the industry. I believe that the intentions of the board and management of the CNLOPB are good, but there are persistent troubling questions about the institutional independence of this regulator and its ability to enforce meaningful punishment for spills. It's just not there. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Peters. So now we have the comments and rebuttal section. This will be in reverse order as it was last time. 45 seconds each candidate has to make a comment. State whose response you're commenting on, and then that candidate will have a 30-second rebuttal. So we start with Mr. Peters' comment.
Thanks very much, Chris. I'm going to be focusing mostly on Mr. Whalen's answers because Mr. Harris represents the New Democrats, and the New Democrats are closer to the Green Party's position in their book, but they're small on specifics. So they talk a good game, and they don't have a track record of failure that the Liberals do. So I just want to reiterate this fact that we've been to the well. It's the boy who cried wolf, right? The Liberals, oh, we have a good plan. We have a good plan. Meanwhile, 600 to 700 megatons per year in emissions from Canada. We are a global pariah when it comes to climate change. Per capita, we have the highest emissions in the world. This is not a good story, and we need to change it, right? That's my...
Thank you, Mr. Peters. Now, Mr. Whalen has 30 seconds to rebut.
Thank you, David. I don't think anything be further from the truth. In the past 4 years, Canadians have had a government that has done more to fight climate change than in our country's history. I mean, this is a problem that's been around for a long time. The thermodynamics of climate change have been known since the 1870s. And for the last 4 years, we have worked in a disciplined, diligent way. Hope doesn't grow on trees. It comes from having a plan, working hard to achieving it, and getting the hope from achieving your milestones. And we're on the right path. Please stay with us.
Thank you, Mr. Whalen. Mr. Harris, you now have 45 seconds to comment on one of the other candidates' response.
Thank you, Chris. I don't want to attack any candidates here, but in the interest of having a good debate and an understanding of the position, David, I heard what you said about the offshore situation, and I know that there are obviously significant risks that are available in the offshore because of the nature of the business. But are you suggesting that the tankers moving from offshore to Come By Chance and transshipment that they are so risky that they shouldn't be allowed at all? Is that the position that the Green Party has, that there should be no development and no new development in the offshore in Newfoundland of any kind?
30 seconds, Mr. Peters.
Thanks. No, we in order to sunset an industry, you have to start somewhere, and that somewhere starts with a moratorium on exploration and development licenses. For sure, as long as Come By Chance is operating, it's been operating with Band-Aids and chewing gum for decades. and it's a huge polluter. It needs to be mothballed soon. Obviously, we have a significant but small risk with the tankers. I just hope and pray
Thank
that
you, Mr. Peters.
we don't see a disaster.
That's all the time we have for that. Mr. Whalen, you get your 45 seconds to comment or ask a question to
Thank
one
you
of the
very
other
much. And
candidates.
obviously, we're a party that's trying our best to balance the environment and the economy. It's somewhat unfortunate that we don't have a Conservative candidate here who could talk about how they would scrap Bill C-69 and scrap our price on pollution. But we're interested both in the environment and the economy. And Mr. Peters, when you say that the Green Party would limit and end exploratory drilling, in Newfoundland and Labrador, that is the silver lining to our economy. We have $4.6 billion of commitments for people to go out and look for what's estimated to be $400 billion worth of oil. We don't want the Russians, the Saudis, the Venezuelans to get that market share. We want to be selling the last clean barrel of oil with the lowest upstream emissions. That's what Newfoundland has to offer. We're fighting with Norway for that last barrel, and I'm not sure why we would abandon
Thank you,
our
Mr. Whalen.
resources.
Mr. Peters, you have 30 seconds.
I don't mean to, when I hear, that clean oil, I think of Donald Trump's clean coal, It's not clean. It's not clean, and it's not, the carbon footprint of extracting oil in Saudi Arabia, frankly, is a lot lower than the extraction. The climate doesn't care where the oil is from, The science is the science. We have to sunset this industry. This is a fact. That's it.
And thank you to all the candidates for your answers to those questions. We'll move along to question 3. It's on oil and gas and fisheries. There's been criticism of the province's regulator for opening bids for oil and gas exploration in marine refuge areas like the Northeast Newfoundland slope and on fishing grounds that harvesters and communities depend on for a living. This seems opposed to the spirit of Bill C-68, which aims to ensure greater protection for fish and marine habitat as well as for fisheries and coastal communities. As a member of Parliament, how will you ensure the sustainability of our fisheries and fishing-dependent communities in a province that seems to have doubled down on oil extraction? That's our question 3. And Mr. Peters, we begin with you, and you have 2 minutes.
Thank you, Chris. The short answer here is we cannot ensure the sustainability of our fishery and fisheries communities if we allow oil and gas exploration in marine refuges. We can't even guarantee the sustainability of our fisheries if we prohibit oil and gas exploration in marine refuges. Oil and gas exploration in marine refuges in 2019 is not only likely in violation of Bill C-68, it's making the same mistake as we made in the last half of the 20th century. Mismanaging a renewable resource for short-term profit, in this case that profit being in a product that when extracted and burned is literally destroying the climate on which we and all other life on Earth depends. Our choice is clear. We will continue to race toward the climate abyss by doubling down on oil, or we will do what we can over the next months to remake our society with a chance to make it sustainable. This sounds alarmist, I know, but the scientific fact is that we are at grave risk of global climate collapse, and the time is incredibly short to have a chance to fix it. Look, as a group of candidates, including the one that's not here, we're 4 old white guys, yeah? Which is sad. We are not reflective of the diversity of the communities we seek to represent. But one of these old white guys, this one, is promoting a platform that follows what the scientists tell us we have to do to contribute to 1.5 mean global temperature rise. We've flipped the narrative in this election. It used to be that people believed a vote for the Green Party was a wasted vote. Given the climate emergency and the platforms of the 4 national parties, voting for any party other than the Green Party in 2019 is a wasted vote.
Thank you, Mr. Peters. And up next, Liberal candidate, Mr. Whalen.
Thank you very much. A lot of people may not be as close to this issue as I am and may not understand some of the difference between marine protected areas, marine refuges, other effective area-based conservation measures. So the reason Canada is protecting these parts of our ocean is because of international agreements that were entered into and which the previous government and the previous elected representatives did virtually nothing about. When we took office in 2015, only 1% of our ocean was protected. We've gotten that up to 14% now. We only had half of our land protected that we need to protect, and now we have 17%. We're shooting to protect 25% by 2025 of ocean and land, and 30% by 2030. But when we talk about marine protected areas, which are the the more like the parks in the ocean. Those are like off the southern coast in the Laurentian Channel, where no industrial activity will be allowed. A marine refuge is a different type of thing. It's where we're going to allow certain types of activities in certain ways. And the marine refuge that exists on the northeast slope of Newfoundland and Labrador is special because of its cold water coral. So what we're protecting there is cold water coral. And the reason why oil and gas activity is allowed there is because there's conditions on the oil and gas companies that they need to go down with ROVs, scan the bottom, make sure they're not drilling on top of the coral. When they get the muds from their drilling, they have to clean them and deposit them in areas where there is no coral. So these are some of the ways in which you can have certain limited types of economic activity in a place where you expect to extract $400 billion worth of oil and gas without damaging the thing you're trying to protect there, which is cold water coral. Whereas trawling the bottom for turbot in those areas is going to hurt the coral. So it's the proper, sensible approach that we can have our oil and gas prosperity so we can transition our economy. These changes we're talking about are not inexpensive. Our plan is expensive and requires a prosperous country to enact it. Thank you.
Thanks, Mr. Whalen. Mr. Harris, your 2 minutes start now, and if I could ask you to just refrain until the end to give your applause. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris. Well, we need, first of all, to listen to the science from public servants and academics to keep our fisheries sustainable. That's the important top line for work in the marine environment offshore. But I do have a serious problem with the fisheries side of this. 30 years ago, before we had our oil and gas development, there was a lot of discussion in this province of how the fisheries and the oil and gas industry can live together. There was lots of meetings and conferences and get-togethers, and everybody was working on a consensus to try and ensure that this could happen. In fact, when oil and gas development actually started, there was the development of a One Ocean group with people from the fish harvesting industry, the Fishermen's Union, the fisheries companies, and the government and the oil companies to work together to ensure that the conflicts, if there were any, were resolved, whether it be with seismic or whether it be with drilling, whether it be with activities. That consensus seems to have broken down. And we've recently had this government offer through the CNLOPB, with no consultation with the Fishermen's Union, licenses or bidding process to give access to exploration on a serious, significant crab, where half the crab from fish harvesters is actually caught. That is an outrageous abdication of the notion of the fisheries and the oil and gas industry operating together, and I think something needs to be done to fix that. We have regulations under C-68 that have not been promulgated yet. We need to have stiff regulations there to ensure that this issue of making sure that the fisheries is not interfered with, that our fish stocks are not hurt, and that we need to ensure that we have science integrity to ensure scientists do their jobs and can give this advice, and we want to protect 30% of the oceans by 2030.
You now have 45 seconds to make a comment on one of the other candidates' answer.
Well, I think the comment I would have is the question is how would you, maybe to Nick Whalen, how would you deal with the issue of the Fishermen's Union and the fish harvesters and the 300 communities that depend on the fisheries in this province, needing to be sure that their access to resources is not going to be interfered with by actions such as the CNLOP undertook without consultation with the Fishermen's Union, without consultation with the fish harvesters and communities. Governments have been promising that they will have consultation, but they say that, but then they don't deliver. And I think that that's an affront to the livelihoods and the incomes of fish harvesters and the whole fishing industry and the communities that depend on it.
30 seconds, Mr. Whalen.
Thanks, Mr. Harris. I think what we see here is a situation where Canada is finally acting to protect our offshore oceans. We've protected 10%, And we have the One Ocean Group, which exists to help moderate the discussions and different industrial users who might want to have access to our oceans. I think that's the appropriate approach to take to make sure that we have a future in our fishery. The oil might be our present, but our future is in the sustainable fishery and ensuring that we manage our ecosystem from an ecosystem-wide approach, and then we protect areas that need to be protected.
Thank you. And you have 45 seconds to comment on another candidate's answer.
Thank you very much. And maybe this is a question for Mr. Harris. You'd mentioned that you were upset that we haven't promulgated some of our regulations under Bill C-68 or Bill C-69. Does the NDP agree that Bill C-68 and Bill C-69 were important pieces of legislation for transportation, fisheries, natural resources, and environmental assessments?
Well, first of all, I'm certainly not upset that the government hasn't promulgated regulations under Bill C-68. I mean, the bill was only passed in June. You shouldn't be promulgating regulations until you've adequately consulted with the people who are affected. I know there's a great interest on behalf of the fish harvesters and the fishing community to ensure that the regulations are robust and that they're strong enough and that they are done with the exact needs of their industry in mind to make sure that something like this just happened
Thank you, Mr. Harris.
never happens again.
And thank you to all of the candidates. And that is the end of the answers for question 3. Question 4 is about the fishery. Recently, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change released a report on oceans and a changing climate, concluding, and I quote, "The global ocean has warmed unabated since 1970 and has taken up 90% of that excess heat. Marine heat waves happen twice as often as they did in 1982 and have doubled in intensity. And since 1993, the rate of ocean warming has doubled. These changes are already affecting the distribution of fish and decrease their abundance and fisheries catch potential due to climate change. They're projected to affect income, livelihoods, and food security of marine resource-dependent communities. As well, long-term loss of degradation of marine ecosystems compromise the ocean's role in cultural, recreational, and intrinsic values important for human identity and well-being. Given the risks that climate change poses to our ocean ecosystem, what actions will you take to protect our fisheries and those who depend on them?" And we begin, and Mr. Peters, you start, and you have 2 minutes.
Thank you, Chris. Climate change-induced ocean acidification, ocean temperature increase, overfishing, and ocean pollution have devastated marine ecosystems around the globe. The cod moratorium in 1992 and the slow recovery of the northern cod were on the leading edge of this ecological collapse. The lag effect and the cumulative nature of climate change means bad outcomes are hard-coded. We will lose all or most of coral reefs around the world. Species will migrate and adapt where they can. Invasive species are creating mostly threats, but some opportunities. In-ocean aquaculture is deeply problematic, as the recent mass salmon die-off in Fortune Bay attests. How did we get to a point where we have media coverage of a mass die-off with reporters shrugging their shoulders? A sustainable fishery in the next 20 years looks forward and back to new practices and old. It looks forward in aquaculture, in removing these operations from the oceans where they pollute and devastate the wild species they live adjacent to. Aquaculture has great potential, but it must operate in land-based pens with green waste management powered from emissions-free sources. The future fishery looks forward as well by freeing climate science from the muzzling and political games of DFO bureaucrats and lawmakers. We must also look backward in the management of the wild fishery. The future of the wild fishery is small-scale, locally managed, with community cooperatives and small-scale harvesters regulated but encouraged to market competitively with increased say in the management of the resource near their shores. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Peters. Mr. Whalen, you have 2 minutes.
Thank you very much. And this is a very important and timely question because, as Mr. Peters has raised the issue of the aquaculture deaths that are largely attributable to heat, it's important for us to realize that it's not just the fish that are affected or the economy, the ecology. It's people's livelihoods, people who are going to be out of work for over a year. Their families are affected, their communities are devastated. So we have to make sure that when we regulate the oceans, we do it in a responsible way. We've brought in new regulations, and as Jack has mentioned, it's recent legislation, so we're still working through it to make sure that the regulations are promulgated, that we do the right consultations, and it's not just on fisheries, it's also on our natural resources legislation. Some of the things that we've done recently, I mean, you look at the Manolis L. In 1985, that vessel was leaking oil. And it was only in 2015-16 that we got the studies done as a government to help clean up that oil spill, that potential disaster of the Manolis L in our waters. We look to the safety issues on our offshore and how they, under the previous parliaments, Harper had eliminated our search and rescue, and we brought the search and rescue back, and we opened a new Atlantic headquarters for the Canadian Coast Guard right here in St. John's. We're here. I mean, we've never had a better friend in Ottawa than Justin Trudeau. He really understands emotionally what our province grapples with. He understands that our president might be in oil and gas, but our heart is in the fishery, and he's doing everything he can, along with Catherine McKenna, Jonathan Wilkinson, and all 7 Liberal MPs are working to make sure that when we get back into a fully fledged commercial fishery in cod, it's sustainable, it's local, and it meets the needs of our communities. But we're not quite there yet, but this is why you need to re-elect us so we can continue this work. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Whalen, and 2 minutes to you, Mr. Harris.
Thank you very much. Of course, the warming ocean is obviously one of the most significant consequences of climate change, and a serious impact on marine food webs that sustain the commercial fishery and sustain the oceans themselves. So clearly the fisheries is under threat. If we're going to rebuild the fisheries, which we have a commitment as a party to do, particularly in our province, the northern cod fishery, which was devastated, we've been calling out for not years, but decades for an actual action plan to take that on. It's now in legislation in Bill 68, which we're very glad, C-68, which we're very glad to see that it's actually legislated as a possibility. But we now need to see a plan to put that in place. We have to have an actual specific plan in place. We've got, goals for climate change targets like zero by 2050. We've heard the Liberals talk about, we share the same goals. We have a significant action plan. What we're hearing from Catherine McKinnon is, well, we don't really know the details of how we're going to get there, but, we got to get ourselves through this election first. Well, I don't think that that's good enough for Canadians. We need someone there to keep their feet to the fire if they do get elected and are serious about this, to actually do the things that need to be done. The government, some of the problems that we're having here now, we have communities under threat because there's not simply the fishery itself, but also the actual communities around Newfoundland and Labrador. We have 300 communities that are dependent on the crab fishery, for example, and that's under threat even now with the potential for oil development in that area. So there needs to be respect for the harvesters, respect for the communities, and including the Indigenous communities in our province that have a title to have a say in the development that takes place, but they also have a commitment and a stake in the future, so they need to be consulted for that reason too.
Thank you, Mr. Harris. We now enter the, we've heard from all 3 candidates, and Mr. Harris, as the draw goes, you're up again for 45 seconds to make a comment on the answer of one of the other 2 candidates.
Well, I just, I can make a comment on general on this issue. I think this is something that we all are in the same boat on, that we have a serious problem. The fisheries is dependent upon a climate action plan that's going to stop the ocean from warming. I don't see how that can be done very easily, because we're seeing the ocean warming from down below and coming up. That's a very, very long-term plan. But we can, I suppose, and maybe I can ask Nick if he has any ideas as to how we can actually develop a plan for action on the development of the northern cod in the face of the kind of oil exploration that's going on and being suggested. How would he rebuild the northern cod stock?
We'll give Mr. Whalen 30 seconds to answer.
Thank you very much, because one of the first things that we did after being elected was we rehired a whole bunch of scientists at DFO and allowed them to publish their research, because we believe in evidence-based decision-making. When we selected the first 10% of our offshore area that would be protected, it's because it's ecologically significant. As we move to 25 and 30% targets for, really protecting certain parts of the ocean, it's to make sure that we have contiguous areas of the ocean that are protected, so that our other effective area-based measures work, and that stocks can move, stocks can span, and that's how we're going to do it.
Time. And we have Mr. Peters, you have 45 seconds to make, Mr. Whalen, you're up again. 45 seconds to make a comment on one of the other candidates.
Thank you, Mr. Harris. One of the things that sometimes happens in politics is, a lot of vitriol can be hurled at particular politicians like Catherine McKenna, and then a whole firestorm can ensue. She's a good friend of mine. I went to university with her, as I'd mentioned earlier. When she came to visit our province, she needed an RCMP detail. Her daughter didn't drive with her in the same car. It was horrific, because she's been referred to online as a climate Barbie, and it's just disgusting. She's someone who's worked very hard, and I think that she would have said, if asked whether or not we have a plan that achieves our target by 2030, that we do, and that the PBO report doesn't include things like our public transit money. So, Mr. Harris, my question is to you. How can you say that she says we don't have a plan to achieve it, when everyone in our party is committed in this election to achieving the plan by 2030, exceeding the targets, and meeting the net zero by 2050?
Thank you, Mr. Harris. You now have 30 seconds to respond.
Well, I think there's no personal attack here on Catherine McKenna or anyone. It's just the question that this is what was stated by her, as reported by CBC. It's widely reported that there was no details for this plan and commitment. The implication is that they hope that things will come up, that new technologies or something that will save the day. That's not a plan. And all I said was that there is no plan in place that's going to achieve that target. If you're saying, well, we don't have that detail,
Mr.
we're going to
Harris,
get through the election
your
first.
time is up.
That's her words, not mine.
Mr. Peters, you have now 45 seconds to comment on the answer of one of the other candidates.
Thank you, Chris. So for Nick, please, in-ocean aquaculture repeatedly, systemically devastates wild fish habitats globally. Will the Liberals commit, as we have in the Greens, to requiring terrestrial location of aquaculture?
Thank you very much, David. This is obviously something that all the parties have internal discussions on. My colleagues from the west coast of the country are very much in favor of closed containment aquaculture. The 31 other members of parliament from Atlantic Canada who sat in our caucus feel that there's a certain amount of the work that can be done on land, and if managed properly, there's a certain amount that can happen in the ocean, as happens in most of the rest of the world. This is, billions of tons of protein that are needed to feed people around the world.
Thank you, Mr. Whalen, and thank you to all the candidates for your answers. Let's give them a hand. And take a sip of water, guys, as I'm going to do before we go on to our next question. We're going to be talking about something totally different right now, urban transit. In Newfoundland and Labrador, transportation accounts for 35% of all greenhouse gas emissions. And between 2009 and 2016, per household emissions increased by 40%. Statistics Canada's most recent figures show that overall, 12% of Canadians take public transit to work, but only 3% of Newfoundlanders and Labradorians do. Regionally, we still lag behind. In Halifax, 12% commute using public transit, and as I said, only 3% in St. John's, or in the city of St. John's, and 3% in the province. I'd like to ask each of the candidates, what actions would you take as an MP to shift modes of transportation away from private vehicles? And we begin our question 5 with Nick Whalen.
Thank you very much, Chris. And this is obviously a very important topic because our government brought in place a very robust infrastructure plan when we were elected. One of the things we did was negotiate with all the provinces to put in place targeted amounts of matched funding on things like wastewater, but also urban transit. The federal government is prepared to spend $100 million of matched money in the province of Newfoundland and Labrador on transit. But I think we realize that we need partners. We can't do it alone. We need cities, we need the province to be interested in this. We need projects that are going to work, and we need to show growth in ridership. There's no point in having public transit that no one uses, because we can spend that money on other types of initiatives to help lower climate change. People are working very hard on this. I don't want everyone in the room to feel all upset because Newfoundland isn't doing our part. We are. We just have different demographics than all the other provinces. We are more like a territory when it comes to the population density we have. So we're trying to find solutions that work. I know that there was a proposal that I was pushing hard last year that the university students, if they had transit passes that were cross-subsidized by the federal government and the university, it would grow ridership and allow us to tap into more resources for public transit. But for whatever reason, university students rejected that proposal. But you need to keep trying, because we need to get more people engaged and working in public transit so that it's something that gets people. As an alternative, Newfoundland and Labrador can focus on electric vehicles. We have an electric vehicle subsidy, charging stations, things that allow people to get around their daily lives. In our current platform, we're proposing that we're going to green the transit system, school buses and public buses becoming zero-emission vehicles. So there's things that we can do, but they have to have the buy-in from the population. If folks like university students aren't prepared to do the uptake and people aren't going to ride the buses, we need to find solutions that will work, but we'll always partner with the students when they're ready. Thank you.
Thanks, Mr. Whalen. And up next, we have Mr. Harris. You get 2 minutes.
Thank you very much. This is a very important question. You know, we obviously the statistics tell the story about the amount of people who are using public transit to get to and from work, but we've got a community of communities, of suburbs, of demands for more roads from the province, and everybody wants to drive a car. Well, I've got a radical idea, and our party is prepared to commit to building a fare, free public transit system with cities who are prepared to do the work to make that happen. And that's something that would help to kickstart the process of ensuring that we have people using, if you can get public transit in use, you will have better public transit. If the fares are not, I know people who have trouble even getting to work now because the cost of having to pay for buses in order to make a living if they're on fairly low income. So we need to be radical ideas like that can appeal to people. Perhaps as Nick has pointed out, the students might want to have another referendum. Maybe they should have another one in England as well. But maybe that decision wasn't a wise one, and they might reconsider it. But you know, looking at what the federal government can do, we're committed to having stable and predictable transit funding for municipalities across this country with the planning horizon that allows the decision to be made. We want to have transit that's green by 2025. The entire transit fleet across the country should be electric with low emissions or zero emissions. We want to see that happen very quickly. We want the government of Canada to have its fleet of vehicles emissions free by 2025. These are robust, aggressive plans that need to be undertaken if we're going to kickstart the change to a different type of transit that uses less greenhouse gases.
And Mr. Peters, your 2 minutes start now.
Thank you, Chris. This question raises unique challenges for the voters of St. John's East and the citizens of the Northeast Avalon particularly. Through the 1990s and 2000s, we watched with dismay and sadness because building permits were issued to developments at Stavanger Drive, Kenmount Terrace, Paradise, Galway, and elsewhere. These communities are clear-cut, car-dependent sprawls that are not well-suited to integrated public transit. Expanded public transit opportunities are there, and the Green Party has funds in its budget to accommodate them. The spatial designs of the communities we've built, though, demand that small vehicle transport has to be part of the transportation mix for the foreseeable future. The Green Party budget has allocated substantial funds for electrifying buses. Electrified buses across the country have to happen, and soon. We want in on that action, of course. But the route complexity required to serve neighborhoods on the Northeast Avalon, combined with our entrenched car culture and the overarching need to decarbonize transportation, demands that bus and auto electrification combined with electric vehicle subsidies and an aggressive revenue-neutral carbon fee and dividend will get us around cleanly, sustainably, and conveniently. One last thing. Electric car, bike, and scooter sharing arrangements are happening in other jurisdictions and have to happen here. The question asked about private vehicles, and yes, taking on $15,000 to $75,000 in debt to invest in a rapidly depreciating asset that sits idle and takes up space for parking 95% of the time is not a good idea. Very soon, we'll be able to shed the investment, order a shared charged electric car to come to us when we need it, and let it drive itself to the next gig right after our trip. That's a big part of the solution going forward as well.
Thank you, Mr. Peters. So in reverse order, as we've been doing, Mr. Peters will get 45 seconds to comment on another candidate's answer and say who you're referring to. And that candidate gets 30 seconds to rebut.
I'm going to make a general statement about urban transit. It's our principle in the Green Party of Canada. I don't have a specific question for one of the two candidates. They had some good things to say, and I want to talk a little bit about ecological wisdom in the context of urban transit and all of our plans in the Green Party of Canada. Ecological wisdom is a Green Party core value for urban transit and other things, which means understanding that humans and every other species of animal and plant are integral and interdependent parts of Gaia, our living planet. Yeah? When we degrade the Earth or any part of it, we undermine the integrity and viability of all life, including our own. Electrifying vehicles is an enormous part of our plan, and public transit is part of it too.
Thank you. And since you didn't direct that to a candidate, there's no rebuttal. So we go next to, let me see the order here, is Mr. Harris.
This is a rebuttal?
No rebuttal. You get 45 seconds to make a comment on one of the other candidates' answers.
Okay, well, I think, the idea of having fancy vehicles that will drive themselves to the next fair is a wonderful vision for the future. But I think we have to deal with the realities today. And the realities today is we do have individual privately owned vehicles. We've got to find a way of transitioning people to vehicles that are electric in nature and have put subsidies in place to encourage that. There has to be significant transformation in the automobile manufacturing industry to promote that as well. So one of the things of doing that is to create the demand. And our plan to insist that the federal government fleet of vehicles be electrified by 2025, that will start creating demand, and we want to also
Thank you, Mr. Harris.
add additional subsidies to people.
And I'd like to remind
do
the
that.
candidates that this section is a comment on the other candidates' answers, not a continuation of your answer.
I think it might have been a comment on David, actually.
Yeah, but you need to state so.
It's about new cars that are going to drive themselves
Right,
around.
yeah, so just for clarity, give you 30
Yeah,
seconds. Yeah, you have to state who you're responding to, Mr. Harris.
Yeah, just a quick comment. The car share arrangements are widely in place all across major urban centers in North America now. And driverless vehicle technology is very close as well. It's been tested. The machines are a lot safer. For those elderly people who fear the loss of mobility, the shared electric vehicle is going to be very helpful to us in late life, keeping us moving without a serious carbon footprint.
Thank you. And we are halfway through, and thank you. We still have to hear from Mr. Whalen, and then we're halfway through. And I'm just going to say to everyone, we'll have about a 3-minute break after we hear from Mr. Whalen, let you all stretch your legs. You have 45 seconds, sir.
Thank you very much. My question will be for Mr. Harris. It relates to the NDP proposal to have free public transit. One of the things that we believe in as Liberals is that we need to have proper pricing mechanisms so that we make good decisions. And sometimes when you make things free, or when you promise to make something free that's really somebody else is responsible for the costs, then you lose cost control and you lose public confidence in your ability to manage the money. We talk about it with tuition, where the provinces were going to set the tuitions, but the federal government can't pay for that. In the case with public transit, it's the municipalities that determine the cost. So how can the federal government say that it's going to pay unknown costs for public transit? Wouldn't it be better to have some type of known subsidy, Mr. Harris? Thank you.
Thank you. We have 30 seconds, Mr. Harris.
Well, first of all, it's a radical idea and a novel idea. It does involve working with cities that are serious about doing this. The idea is to kickstart a public transit system and the use of public transit. And what better place in the country to do that in a place like St. John's, where people are resistant to it for various reasons. They don't even know that the system is more efficient now than it used to be, and people can know when the buses are coming with their smartphones and all of those things. So this has to be started somewhere. It's not a matter of writing a check for anybody. It has to be a city that's interested.
Now we're at the halfway mark. And thank you to all the candidates. We've gone through 5 questions. I'd like to thank them all for their thoughtful answers. So right now we're going to put the...
What are we doing now?
we're going to take 3 minutes. We're going to take 3 minutes. You stretch your legs, and we're going to put you on a timer too. So be back in your seat in 3 minutes. Yeah, because they didn't. Nobody went overtime, and so, yeah, and everybody had there was quite a number of, and I'm just moving through there's no sense. I don't have to each time take 1 minute to describe what we're doing, right? Yeah. Yes. 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 Yeah. On one, yeah. Right. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, so, yeah, there's no rebuttal on the next ones. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, so, yeah, so, yeah. And then, yeah. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah, that's the worry on these campaigns.
No, it's fine. A little bit of a different format, which is good. And it breaks it up for the audience, too. Yeah. Okay, all right. Great.
Sarah and I go early in the morning because she's got to get her scooter in and out, so you can't go at 11 o'clock. What's this do? So we have to go I don't mind having less Costco.
No, I don't know.
Okay, folks, you might want to start making your way back to your seats. We have less than a minute before we begin the next half of the debate. Grab some water.
Are you done by 9:30?
Yeah, we're ahead of time.
Oh,
We're 9 minutes ahead of time.
the moderation time is a big.
Well, yeah, the allowances are not being used.
Yeah.
Questions.
Okay, and we'll do those at the end.
Yeah. So I don't know which order you want.
And yeah, okay, that's fine. I'll have it.
I'll take a look while.
Yes. Okay. Yep. Would you take your seats, please? And we'll begin part 2, which will be done in a little bit of a different format, and I'll explain that when everybody's seated. So as we mentioned in the beginning that the speaking times would be weighted toward local questions, so we're heading into questions that are more national in origin right now. So what will happen, I will ask questions 6, 7, and 8, and each of the candidates will be given 1 minute to respond. There won't be a rebuttal immediately. We will have the rebuttal following all 3 questions. So the next 3 questions will be 1 minute to each candidate. I'll tell you the order, and then the rebuttal will come later. We're all good to go?
I think we're still waiting for David.
Oh, David. Okay, okay. I knew we were missing someone. No, we can't start without one of our candidates. So in the one, rebuttal, they can rebut to any of the questions of any of the answers. Right. One responsive. Yeah. Right. Yeah. Right. So, Mr. Peters, in the next, as I mentioned, in the next three questions, which are more of national significance, we will ask the three questions, and I'd like you all to keep in mind, because the rebuttal will be to either of the answers of either of the three questions when we get to that point. So 3 questions with a minute each for all of you, and keep track of the answers of your opponents here, and you can ask a question or make a comment based on any of the answers of those 3 questions. So just keep that in mind as we go along. Our next question is on water. Many Canadians know that our country has the longest coastline in the world, but less well known is that Canada is home to roughly half the world's lakes, an equivalent volume of the world's fresh water, and roughly only 1/4 of the world's wetlands. Canadians are witnessing the impact that industrial development and climate change is having on our water. We are seeing a growing number of pollution hotspots, and the Insurance Bureau of Canada has noted that climate change, as well as historic loss of wetlands across Canada to industrial development, has led to a 250% increase in flooding over the past 2 decades, as well as a reduction in water quality and wildlife habitat. The question for the candidates: what can the federal government do to work with different actors, such as municipalities, to reduce both water pollution and the risk of flood events, which have been aggravated by industrial development and climate change? That's the 6th question of the evening. And in random order, Mr. Harris, you will be the first to respond, and you will have 1 minute to answer the question.
Thank you very much. Of course, as we pointed out, Canada is one of the countries with the most fresh water on the planet, and Newfoundland and Labrador is blessed with an abundance of water as well. But we know that we have to do better as a country. As was pointed out, the loss of wetlands and good water has to be fixed. We will recognize Canada's right to a healthy environment by enshrining it in law and creating an environmental bill of rights to ensure people have the legal right to access to clean water and land. We want the National Freshwater Strategy to work with the provinces and territories to protect waterways, and we would restore the Navigable Waters Protection Act that was gutted by the Conservatives while they were in power, and that hasn't been replaced by the Liberals since they've come about. But we would want to do that so that these waterways and lakes would be protected as they were before.
Thank you, Mr. Harris. Next, Mr. Peters.
In our platform, the Green Party of Canada promises to assign and implement protected status to a minimum of 30% of fresh waters, oceans, and land by 2030. We propose the establishment of a Council of Canadian Governments involving a linkage between federal, Indigenous, provincial, and municipal governments that will prepare for and manage issues like climate-adapted flood protection, pollution prevention, and containment. We will commit $100 million annually over the 4 years of the electoral mandate to create Indigenous-led, protected, and conserved areas. We will fund stewardship of these lands and waters by Indigenous guardians. We will fully restore the Canadian Environmental Assessment Act, which was gutted by the Harper Conservative government in 2012. We will adopt the recommendations of the Independent Expert Panel on Environmental Assessment, commissioned by the Liberals, which they have largely ignored. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Peters. You have a minute, Mr. Whalen.
Thank you very much. You know, this is one of the times I wish there was a Conservative candidate up here with us, because we reopened the experimental lakes area, which is one of the most important lake ecology research institutions in the world, which they had shuttered. We're completing projects on flood mapping for the country to help people better ascertain where they can build to avoid floods, and as climate change, that becomes important. Locally, when people think about making sure we have clean water and we don't pollute our water, people are thinking about wastewater treatment, and I've been on record saying that a Liberal government will work with municipalities to make sure they meet the 2012 regulations, in respect of which basically nothing was done by two previous governments to help our local municipalities meet those regulations. The money was left stranded. We've spent the money that was there on projects that exist, and we'll continue to work with municipalities to make sure they're no longer dumping raw sewage into our oceans. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Whalen. We move on to question 7, which is on wilderness conservation. Asked about what they most love about our country, Canadians point first to natural beauty, wildlife, and spectacular wilderness areas. Yet we are falling below our international commitments to protect these spaces, and our parks and other protected areas are not funded at the level needed to conserve the diverse plants and animals that live there. A recent study shows that 50% of Canadian wildlife species are in decline. 94% of Canadians value the emotional and physical benefits of spending time in nature. However, 82% say they're concerned that future generations won't have close or easy access to nature. The question to the candidates: what will you do to protect the quality and quantity of wilderness in Canada? Our first answer goes to Mr. Whalen, and you have 1 minute, sir.
Thank you very much. Similar to the proposal by the Green Party, we're prepared to protect in a very robust way 30% of our land and 30% of our oceans by 2030. I think this is important. We've agreed to spend the sufficient funds to plant 2 billion trees by 2030 because it's important. We've put historic funding into parks to rehabilitate their infrastructure and make them more climate resilient. And we're actively encouraging and helping people, including low-income youth, use our parks, get out into nature so that they can overcome the very deficiency that this question raises. But it's more than that, because Canadians love our planet. We love our country and how beautiful it is. We have an opportunity now to do something meaningful, to change the paradigm for our economy to a clean one. And we have a party that is, if they win on October 21st, is going to roll back the clock on everything we've accomplished these last 4 years. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Mr. Peters.
Our duty in wilderness conservation is to live on Earth with the lightest touch possible. As we draw on Earth's systems to meet our basic needs and enjoy a high quality of life, we should not do irreparable harm to those systems or to other species. This is an ethical issue as well as a practical one. As part of a global community, our duty is to all life, not just our own. This ecological wisdom is being eroded under Liberal and Conservative governments. Look at the sign war in St. John's East that even the NDP has joined with breathtaking gusto. My God, how much money, wood, plastic, and ink has been wasted all over this country to sell us fanciful and somewhat deceitful ideas that they have a plan to protect the wilderness. It's somewhat ironic, isn't it? As the organizers noted in the question, though, we know in our hearts and in our bones the value of nature, of being in the quiet of nature. When we touch it, we realize our connectedness to it and our responsibility, after having crippled it, to restore it to the best way we can.
Thank you, Mr.
Do you
Peters.
trust the sign people, or do you trust the party
Thank you,
where
sir.
the name means something, the Green Party? Thank you.
Jack Harris, your minute starts now.
Thank you. I happen to have a strong record on wilderness conservation in this province, fighting against clear-cutting old-growth forests in the main river in western Newfoundland, fighting for the Protected Areas Plan that was been lobbied by CPAWS, the Protected Area Association, the World Wildlife Fund, and fighting against the golf course being placed in sensitive area near Windmill Bight. So I'm very connected with this issue. Our plan would be protect 30% of our land, freshwater resources, and oceans by 2030, and back that protection with funding and enforcement. We'll protect biodiversity by using all the federal tools under the Species at Risk Act and ensure the implementation of recovery strategies for any of the species at risk. This is a very important issue for our party, that we ensure that everybody has an opportunity to enjoy our wilderness forever into the future.
Thank you to all three candidates for your answers. We move on now to question 8, and as I mentioned, we'd get to the rebuttal section after question 8. And this is about pollution and toxic substances. Over the last several decades, Canada has made big strides to improve the health of Canadians and our environment by regulating toxic substances, legal limits on lead in gasoline, restricting chemicals like DDT and ozone-depleting substances. The Canada-US acid rain agreement and the phase-out of coal-fired electricity have had an enormous positive impact on the health of Canadians and our environment. That's saved lives, prevented illnesses, and saved billions of dollars in avoided care costs. However, air pollution is still the leading environmental cause of death and illness in Canada, and Canada remains the only westernized, industrialized nation without legally binding national air pollution standards. In addition, our laws and regulations have not kept pace with emerging threats from newer toxic substances in our environment, including those in everyday consumer products. Many of these products have demonstrated links to cancer, genetic damage, developmental problems, chronic illnesses, and many other health effects. These effects are often more severe for children and vulnerable populations. The overarching toxics law, the Canadian Environmental Protection Act, has not been significantly strengthened in 20 years. Question to the candidates. What will you do to ensure that Canadians are better protected from the health and environmental impacts of toxic substances? Mr. Harris, you go first, and you have a minute.
Well, the first move is obvious. We need to strengthen and modernize the Canadian Environmental Protection Act to make sure that Canadians are safe from toxins. You know, this hasn't been seriously upgraded in 19 years. It's shocking that the things that we're talking about, acid rain, that happened in the late 80s. So these kind of improvements were made, but we still don't have anything but what are called Canada-wide standards when it comes to protecting federal standards for the loose use of toxins. We don't have a legally binding and enforceable federal standards. They're only guidelines that provide minimal protection. So that has to be done. It has not been addressed in the last 4 years, and it hasn't been addressed for some time. They're not keeping pace with changes in industry. We have had some issues brought forward, some by independent people in Parliament. Megan Leslie, one of our colleagues in the Parliament, the last Parliament that I was in.
Thank you, Mr. Harris.
A strong move for microplastic, microbeads.
Your minute's up.
All right.
Your
Maybe I'll
minute's
get
up.
another chance.
You'll get a chance, don't worry. Mr. Whalen, you'll get your minute starting now.
Thank you very much. Despite what my colleagues might suggest, we have not been resting on our laurels for the past 4 years. We have committed to eliminating coal by 2030. This will lead to a major reduction in mercury emissions, one of the most toxic substances, while allowing for a just transition for employees. We've had massive investments in green infrastructure to help reduce pollution that has made its way into our waterways. It was a Liberal government that banned the import, sale, use, and export of asbestos and asbestos-using products. And in the future, we have a plan in place to eliminate many of the worst types of single-use plastics, which will mean less microplastics in the environment. And we have also committed to a plan to introduce as soon as possible a bill to reform the Canadian Environmental Protection Act, as has been demanded by the opposition parties. This is all important work that needs to be done. Not mentioned is the pesticides and the neurotoxins that exist in our food system. There's so much we have to work on together. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Whalen. And a minute for you now, Mr. Peters.
Thank you. Some of the things in our platform on toxic substances. 1, set targets for reducing the use of pesticides in agriculture through programs to assist farmers in moving to organic and regenerative farming. 2, invoke the precautionary principle in making decisions about approval of products, substances, projects, and processes where there is the potential for irreversible harm. If there's no scientific proof of safety, the approval will be withheld. 3, revive and expand the National Pesticides Monitoring and Surveillance Network. 4, ban bee-killing neonicotinoid pesticides and support farmers in shifting to alternatives. 5, ban all forestry and cosmetic use of glyphosate-based herbicides. 6, implement an extended producer responsibility program to hold manufacturers financially responsible for the waste associated with the production, distribution, packaging, and end of life of their products. 7, require an increasing percentage of recycled plastic and durable plastic products. And we needed more time for this question.
You'll get some time. You'll get some time because Well, just recap the rebuttal here and explain how that's going to work. So it'll work for the last 3 questions, and you'll get a chance to rebut something one of the other colleagues, your colleagues has said. Identify who that is, and you'll get 30 seconds for that, and the person you are responding to will get 30 seconds to rebut you. So we begin with Mr. Peters for question 6, 7, and 8. You get to rebut for 30 seconds one of your colleagues.
30 seconds.
Yes.
Thank you. So for Nick, there are hundreds of thousands of toxic substances. We are a living laboratory, a living experiment, canaries in the coal mine on toxic substances. I will ask Nick if the Liberal Party is interested in implementing the precautionary principle for the approval of toxic substances or substances that are possibly toxic.
Okay, thank you for your question. Mr. Whalen.
I have to admit that I'm not precisely sure whether or not our party is committed to that particular principle, but I myself am personally committed to it. I feel that we've allowed things to go too far, certainly in the agriculture sector, to get minimal gains in productivity at a great cost to the environment and to human health. And Canada is somewhat of a pariah on the international stage with respect to our use of glyphosate in our canola and other agricultural products. We need to revisit that. Less production for a higher value, cleaner product is the way
Thank
to
you,
go.
Mr. Whalen. And you can stand up again because you get 30 seconds now to rebut the answer of one of your colleagues to the last 3 questions.
I really agree with almost everything my colleagues have been saying for the last 3 questions, including ending the sign war. So I just want to say that without having a Conservative candidate on the stage, it's really difficult to have an honest conversation about where the political debate in this country is. We're very deep into this election, and it looks very much like, with 60 ridings in play, that there could be an Andrew Scheer government or a Justin Trudeau government on October 21st. And I think that you see that we have a party, the Liberal Party, that has a plan for both the environment and the economy, and that's the way we should go.
Thank you, Mr. Whalen.
Thank you.
Mr. Harris, since we don't have anyone to rebut here because it wasn't directed at anyone, you get 30 seconds on the last 3 questions and identify who you're directing it at.
Well, thank you. I guess I'll direct it at Mr. Whalen. You know, we've had the questions that we have here are very important. They have to do with toxic substances that affect everybody. We do have, there's no question that there's much work to be done, as you pointed out, as I've said, in terms of the kind of things that the Act hasn't been updated. We have a need for a review of enforcement and all of those things. But, you know, in terms of your comments about what government we're going to elect, we're here to decide who to send to Ottawa and what kind of parliament are we going to have, and that's the important question.
Thank you.
Sure. Well, thank you very much. I'm glad to have this opportunity to reach out to the people in this room and let them know a little bit about me, about how my mind works, how I use my analytical skills to investigate problems and to approach them from a place of problem solving rather than fear. For the last 4 years, I've done that on your behalf, and we've seen the fruits of our labors in a number of ways, including the repatriation of the Environmental Assessment Office here. So important decisions about our economy and our environment are made right here in St. John's in our riding. So please, this is why you should vote for me. I'm super prepared. I work super hard. And I approach things the right way.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
So right now, we're going to take a couple of minutes to look at the audience questions. We have a number of them here. So we're just going to take 2 minutes to decide, and then each of 3 of you will get a minute to answer. So thank you for your questions, and just give us a moment. We have time for 3, okay, all right.
No, this is brand new.
Just ask this one.
Oh, that's what I'm going to break up my paper.
Okay, okay. Yeah. Okay. So since we're doing so well on time, I take no credit for that. You've been keeping to time very nicely. We're going to ask 3 audience questions because you've come out tonight and given your time. So if we have the time, we can ask the candidates an extra question. And how this will work, I will ask a question, and then each of the candidates will get 1 minute, and then we'll go through the comments and rebuttals to each individual question from the audience. Our first one is, the IPCC says energy from oil needs to drop 37% by 2030 for Earth to have a chance of staying below 1.5% of warming. Conversely, it says we need an increase of greater than 400% in renewable energy over the same time. How do you plan to position Canada so that it is a leader in growth renewables? And I'm combining this with another question which is on the same topic, because one of you asked about solar and what's the next step in that area. So we're asking you how you position yourself, the country, so that Canada is a leader in growth renewables, and in doing so sees Canada workers lead the transition without being left behind. So that's a question, a combined question, because they were so similar. We put them together, and we asked Mr. Whalen. You have 1 minute to respond to that question.
Thank you very much. We've done a number of things already to help spur innovation in this sector. What we're proposing in this particular election is tax rebates of 50% for corporations that would create zero-emission products. This is to help spur this side of the industry because, of course, everyone recognizes that this challenge is also an opportunity. The more Canadian products that are made to grapple with climate change, the new types of battery technology, new types of transistors or whatnot for solar cells, or whatever the new product is that helps us grapple with this monumental product, we want that to be developed in Canada. One of the things that we've done is create different superclusters where Canada has niche expertise across the country. In Atlantic Canada, there's an ocean supercluster. To the extent we can get some developments there in tidal energy or some other type of advance, who knows what will come from our investments in primary science. But the Liberal Party has been a leader in that for the last 4 years and will continue to be so. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Whalen. Up next, Mr. Peters, you have a minute.
Thanks so much. So as I mentioned earlier, our emissions are about 700 megatons per year, CO2 equivalent, and they tend still to wax and wane with the economy rather than with significant effort on the part of the federal government in legislation and regulation to reduce those emissions, which we're told, as the questioner said, have to be reduced by 45% plus by 2030. That means we got to get from 700 to 385, or whatever the math is there. 700 now, 385 soon, yeah? So Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Newfoundland, Labrador on the way up. The rest of the country on the way down. What is going on there? Petroleum extraction, right? This is the elephant in the room. We have to sunset the petroleum industry. This is one of the elephants in the room. But we can transition the workers. Iron and Earth are a group of courageous tar sands workers who are now working in renewable energy. This is what we propose
Mr. Peters.
to ramp up.
Your time is up. Mr. Harris, you get a minute starting now.
Thank you. Obviously, we have a significant challenge in front of us, and our party is committed to attacking that challenge by investing heavily in research and development, by creating 300,000 new jobs that would help that transition to create the alternatives that we need. And we not only to create them, as Nick pointed out, here in Canada, to develop some of these technologies, but we also have to be cognizant of the fact that we can provide leadership in the world and to provide technologies that can help other countries to themselves assist in reduction of greenhouse gas emissions and move to an economy that is less reliant on fossil fuels for their energy requirements. That, I think, is an important element but it requires a significant effort and a commitment from all hands. And we're seeing here at this
Thank you, Mr. Harris.
That there's a
You'll
commitment
get more
to do
time.
that.
Don't worry. The next segment we will ask, and Mr. Harris, you're up next. We're going to ask you to address a comment. We'll give you 30 seconds, and in the interest of generating a little bit of debate, if I could ask you to address it to one of the other candidates so that we could generate some discussion back and forth. So, Mr. Harris, you get 30 seconds and address that to one of the other two candidates.
I'll ask a question because I think if we don't need to jab at each other and generate debate, but I hear Mr. Peters with his suggestion that we have to start immediately rolling back the oil industry. What we need, I think, is to see that whatever happens happens as a result not of someone dictating you should not do this anymore, but that we put our ceilings on emissions and then the
Thank you,
decisions
Mr.
get
Harris.
made.
Mr. Peters,
would you
you
agree
get
with that?
30 seconds.
I really love it when I get challenged because it means that the Green Party is becoming somewhat relevant. You know, it's wonderful when we're threatened, when we're a threat to somebody if they're asking me questions, so I welcome the question. We've talked about issuing a moratorium on new licenses. We don't want to go out and put shackles on the existing platforms. No, we want to redirect Canadian oil, redirect Newfoundland oil for Canadian markets, refine it here and use it here, stop importing foreign oil, but we have to sunset the industry.
Thank you very much, Mr. Peters.
Has to happen.
Thank you very much. Now you do get another 30 seconds to direct a comment at one of the other two gentlemen.
Oh gosh, I mean, you know, we're late in the evening. You know, I just, the question that keeps coming into my head is we're back at this again 4 years later. You know, we were here in 2015, and I wonder if the Liberal Party, it's amazing that they're doing as well as they are in the polls. If climate change is the issue in this election, I don't know how people are buying it again, you know? But I guess that's just something that you folks
Thank
will
you,
have to
Mr.
decide
Peters.
as voters.
Mr. Whalen, your
I guess
30
that's
seconds.
directed at me. I think Canadians recognize that for the past 4 years, they have a government that's actually going to act, that undid the unilateralism of the Harper government and sent our best people to Paris to help negotiate the best deal possible. The reason there's a 1.5 degrees Celsius target is because Liberals sent Catherine McKenna to Paris to get one. And now we're working towards that. And we have a plan that will achieve our targets by 2030 and net zero by 2050. So there's a reason why our polls are on the rise. It's because people trust us to get the job done, and we will.
Thank you. And
Can I rebut?
no. Oh, yes, yes. Was this directed?
It's directed at
It's your turn.
Nick.
Yes, yes. It's your turn to ask. It's your turn to ask.
Yes, of course.
Yes,
Yeah, so
yes.
thank
That
you.
was your rebuttal, and you also, because of the way the draw works, you get to ask a question. Yes. And I think the gentleman to your left is eager to answer it.
My question is around alternative technologies. There's a high demand for battery technology and for transistors and other electronics. There seems to be quite a shortage of rare earth metals, and Newfoundland and Labrador might be a source for new sources of battery technology and the materials that go into batteries. How does the Green Party feel about investing more money to make sure that as we transition workers from the oil and gas industry, we can put them to work in other natural resources, extractive sectors to help build clean products?
Well, absolutely.
Thank you. You're eager to answer. Let us get the timing set. 30 seconds start now.
Yeah, Inco, I mean, we're producing the minerals that go into rechargeable batteries in Labrador now. It's an opportunity for us. We have to be lighter in our operations up there, but it's a big part of the solution. Musk's new rechargeable battery, they say, he promises a 1 million mile battery. One battery, 1 million miles, 1.6 million kilometers on one battery. Lots of charges with only 10, 20% reduction in the charging capacity. This is the future of transportation. It's a big, Newfoundland has a role in that, and we absolutely have to do it.
Thank you very much. Thank you for your answers to that question from the audience. Hope it was satisfying for you. We're going to move on to another question from the audience now. Given that animal agriculture is the second largest contributor to greenhouse gas emissions and global warming, and yet it's rarely mentioned, what is your party's position on animal agriculture and global warming? And for that question, we begin with Mr. Peters. You have 1 minute.
Thanks so much. I'm a bit remiss in not mentioning this before. It's a little bit difficult because, you know, we can't force people to eat certain things. We can have a robust public awareness campaign on the dangers to public health and to the environment of consuming meat products. Vegans find their home in great numbers in the Green Party of Canada, and we get in a lot of trouble. I'm actually going to mention proactively the seal hunt tonight. Is that amazing or what? Usually the seal hunt, I'm personally in support of the seal hunt if it's sustainable full use, because it's local, it's organic, it's actually pretty decent in terms of animal welfare. The party policy is against the commercial seal hunt. But if you're wrapping up seals in a prohibition on eating meat, that's a fair argument, because eating meat is a catastrophe for the climate. Methane and other greenhouse gases, pollution of aquifers, of groundwater. we have to eat a lot less animal protein. Yeah,
Thank
why do
you.
we pass
Thank you.
vegetable protein through animals? Makes no sense.
Thank you very much, Mr. Peters. And Mr. Harris, you get a minute now.
Thank you. I don't think our party has a position in opposition to animal agriculture as part of the mix in Canada, but we do have concerns about nutrition, we do have concerns about the environment and the consequences to the environment of intensive agriculture, and we support organic farming. We support an approach that provides greater varieties and choice to people, and that's as far as I think we can go with that. You know, it's certainly as Mr. Peters points out, you can't tell people what they eat or what they shouldn't eat, but you can make sure that we do have a sustainable system with the environment in mind. And if it's in there are areas, very clearly areas, where it's not sustainable and the ought not to be able to be carried out, where it is destroying the environment around where the animal agriculture is taking place.
Thank you, Mr. Harris. Your minute starts now, Mr. Whalen.
Thank you. Obviously, we need to have prices on pollution, and if there's a price associated with methane that comes off of the livestock that we capture, and we make sure that polluter pays principle applies and that the costs are passed downstream to the end users. Maybe more farmers will use the technology to capture the methane and burn it for electricity, because the carbon dioxide is only 1/20th the greenhouse gas effect as the methane. I mean, that's one way to very quickly get farmers aligned with our climate change goals. So there are technological tools that can be used to help address this problem without trying to dictate to people what type of protein they eat. But our government is actually putting money into innovation on the agriculture side through another one of the super clusters that's looking at new plant-based proteins. So it's not like we've ignored the other solution, which, as Mr. Peters suggests, is encouraging more people to get their protein from plants. And the Government of Canada agrees, and we are working towards that through an innovation agenda. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Whalen. So now I will introduce the comments and rebuttals to those questions, and we will start with, I'm just looking at my, yes, Mr. Whalen.
Thank you very much. Mr. Peters, you know, a huge amount of Canadians rely on the agriculture industry for their livelihoods. And so how is the Green Party going to juxtapose the needs and the opportunities for farmers to carry on their livelihood and the cultural needs of Canadians to have certain types of food at certain times of the year? Doesn't that fly in the face of the Charter of Rights and Freedoms?
Not in the least.
Mr. Peters.
Not in the least. Green Party wants to incent pesticide-free or reduced pesticide use in organic farming. And we're seeing a great change in Western Canada and the big farms. Monocultures are bad, but canola is bad. And we're seeing a drop in canola partly because of trade issues, but partly because of the explosion in Beyond Meat. And this is a really good news story that there's a big expansion in Western Canada in bean farming and pea farming.
Okay, thank you.
It's
Thank
really
you.
a good news story.
Mr. Harris, you have 30 seconds to direct a comment to one of your opponents here.
Well, I have to say, and I must confess, that agriculture is not my forte, so I don't propose to get into any of the technical aspects of how one deals with the pollution that's caused. It's for me, and I think, Nick, perhaps you can tell us whether you have any standards that would apply that would actually deliver is there anything in place right now? I don't believe there is, that actually does provide the disincentive to this polluter pay
Thank you,
principle
Mr.
that you
Harris.
talk about when it comes to agriculture.
Mr. Whalen?
No, we don't currently have a price on pollution for agricultural products. This was in response to a question that was off the floor, and just to let people understand how my thought process works. I'm looking at this from a scientific standpoint. I understand that methane's the cause, and we can convince farmers to burn the methane. It has a great effect on helping preserve the environment, so we should try to find a way to get them to do that. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Okay. Okay. And an answer to this one? Okay. Okay. And this is the final question. We're just deciding which ones here. We're trying to get them all in. Candidates, You all spoke extensively about how important oil is to the Newfoundland Labrador economy at the Board of Trade debate. How do you see Newfoundland's oil industry and the provincial government's goal of doubling offshore oil by 2030 fitting into your party's stated goals to reduce emissions and Canada's Paris Agreement commitments? And we will start, and we will give Jack Harris 2 minutes.
Thank you, and thank you for the question. It is an important one, and I think you know, here in Newfoundland and Labrador, we all have a significant economic dependence on our oil and gas industry, and I think it does have a role to play in the mix to come. How much of a role is really going to depend on the economics of the industry. Decisions about whether you're going to double the production of oil and gas, they can't be made by the provincial government. Premier Ball has no control over oil production in this province. This is governed by investors, normally, in this case, significant international investors who decide where to produce their oil and where not to. And what we're going to see happen as we introduce climate caps on emissions in Canada that are necessary in order to reach the goals that we have spelled out in our platform, you're going to see investors in the oil industry making decisions. And if they can meet the requirements of coming in under the emissions requirements targets that we have set for nationally, if they can meet the environmental requirements to make sure that the ocean is protected, and if they meet the other requirements of working with Indigenous groups to ensure that they who are affected and have a right to be involved are on side, then they can proceed. And the decisions will be made by them. They won't necessarily decide to go to a high carbon producing place in somewhere else in Canada. They may well come here to develop their resources if they can do that with a lower carbon footprint, with less carbon tax costs, with less trouble getting to the market. That's where the decisions are going to be made. Mr. Ball's target is frankly irrelevant.
Thank you, Mr. Harris. And our next 2 minutes for Mr. Peters.
Thanks, Chris. We signed the Paris Climate Treaty in 2018, which was nice to do. The federal Liberals then adopted the Conservative government's climate target of 30% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions by 2030, which is a lot less than what we are required to do under Paris, which is 45% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions by 2030 compared to 2005 levels. Okay, whether it's 30% down or 45% down, we know it's 45% down. Why are we investing in an industry that is projected by treaty to decrease, all things else being equal, by 45%? That's not a wise investment. It's not doing the right thing. It's not being a responsible global citizen, or are part of it in Newfoundland and Labrador. Why are we doubling down on a product that was destroying the life-sustaining capability of our planet? That's just fact. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chris. There's a lot happening in the world. You know, there's a lot of turmoil, there's a lot of international strife, there are good actors, there are bad actors. The world uses 100 million barrels of oil a day, and I guess Canada produces about 3% of that for sale into international markets. We're going to do everything we can as a Liberal government to work on how much we consume, but we're not going to relinquish global market share to countries like Russia, Saudi Arabia, Iran, Iraq, Venezuela, bad actors who aren't using their prosperity to transition our economy to a clean one. We need our oil and gas prosperity to enjoy our standard of living and to transition our economy. Change is not free. Change is expensive. Change requires money and investment. Our platform commitments are expensive. They're going to require that the economy be firing on all cylinders, that we pay for innovators, and that we use the opportunities that we have. For Newfoundland and Labrador, our opportunities is roughly an estimated value of $400 billion of oil and gas, which is amongst the lowest upstream cost of any oil in the world. And this is what we need to do. We need to be like Norway. We want to ensure that the last barrel of oil used is the cleanest, and it's ours. Well, Norway wants it to be theirs, but we want it to be Newfoundland and Labrador oil because it's the lowest upstream carbon content. And that's what we should be committed to. And then worry about our own house, but not relinquish international market share to other bad actors. So it would be like cutting off your nose to spite your face. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And thank you to you, the audience, for your questions. And let's give our attendees here a hand of applause.
Thank you very much.
So if each of you, we have a little time, so if the audience is willing and you want to, we could give you up to a minute each to make a closing statement, if you choose to do so, because I did cut you off midstream a couple of times, and you've been very good at keeping to time. So if we could give you a minute
I guess
each
we'll
to
keep
get...
following the protocol, so we'll all go first, and then we'll
Yes,
go David
yep,
and then Jeff.
that's right, reverse order. So we'll give you a minute and try to stick to that.
Yes, of course. Thank you all very much for coming here tonight. I know that it's tough to find time away from your families to come talk climate change for 2 hours, and especially when not all the parties are represented. You know, I think of this intractable problem like a bunch of people trying to pull on a rope. And we have, you know, 3 parties that are pulling one way, and then 2 parties are pulling in the other direction. And then we think about all the undecided people out there who are trying to figure out which way to go. But there's only one party that's implemented a plan to help fight climate change. It's the Liberal Party of Canada. And this is the plan that we have. It's the plan that's going to get us to our goal. And so we all need to pull together so that we have enough strength behind us to defeat the other parties that aren't going to try to combat climate change. And there's a lot out there. I know they weren't represented up here tonight, but all you have to do is go online and look at the polls and look at the safe seats and see that there's a real debate in this country about whether or not we have a plan and we continue with the plan that we have, or whether or not we have no plan at all.
Thank you,
and
Mr.
So I
Whalen.
ask you, please consider that.
Mr. Peters, you have a minute.
Thanks, Chris. In closing, the responses of Nick and to some degree Jack, and definitely if Jody was here, would have been on climate change. What the bottom line is, whether it's Saudi oil is dirty or has human rights or blah, 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 oil is a dirty product. And what they're saying is wait. They're saying we can do stuff, but we have to do it. But, you know, we have to rely on the oil industry. Dr. Martin Luther King heard the word wait a lot when he was fighting for civil rights for black people in the United States. And his comment about the word wait was, when they say wait, it usually means never. And that's the record of liberal and conservative governments in this country as regards climate change. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Peters, and over to you, Mr. Harris.
Thank you very much, Chris. And yes, it's been an interesting night, and it's an issue that does engage us all, obviously everybody here in this room, but it engages us all whether we like it or not. But you know, it's all very well to say that the only one with the plan who's trying to implement a plan is the Liberal government, because they're the only government that we've had that has taken it seriously. It's not the only government that would, of course, take it seriously. But I find that, you know, and I've been in Parliament and I've been in the provincial legislature, places work better when you have more than one voice. And you know, when we've got the minister responsible now for climate and for the environment, saying the following after committing to by 2050 getting to net zero emissions, do we have all the details? No, we're going to figure this out. But the first thing we need to do is get through this election. Well, you know, the figuring out is going to happen after the election. And we do need more than one party represented in Parliament from Newfoundland and Labrador to help that out.
Thank you,
and
Mr.
I'm
Harris.
offer myself as that candidate.
I'd like to say thank you to all of you and to all the candidates. I think this has been a very thoughtful and, I would like to say, more than anything, a very respectful debate. And I'd like to thank you all for that. And it's been my very great pleasure to be here. Many of the issues that have been brought up I'm quite familiar with, and as a reporter have covered, and are issues that are important to this place and the people here. So thank you again, and to all of you. And I'll invite Barbara Neese to make her closing remarks. Thank you all.
Well done.
Is Barb here?
Thanks, Joe. Thank you, Jack.
I may
have left the building.
Barb may have left the building. Okay. Ah, there she is. That's for 5 minutes under time, so when does that ever happen? Oh, we're exactly on time. Okay, there we go. Sorry about that, Barb.
I apologize, I forgot. Yeah, closing remarks. I think mainly I'd like to thank all of you for coming, for believing in democracy in this country, and encourage everyone to be engaged in this election as we move forward, particularly around this issue, but also around many others. I think the environment's critically important, and I think from what I've heard tonight, you know, people have their feet to the fire, but we have a long way to go, I think, before we really have a clear plan coming from any of the parties, really, in terms of how we can get from where we are to where we need to go, while at the same time achieving issues like social justice. So those are my closing remarks, beyond thanking Chris and the candidates and all of the volunteers and all of the people who wrote those great questions for their input into organizing and carrying off this debate tonight. Thank you.
Thank you all. Good night.